The streets of New York City in the 1920s were alive with a dangerous rhythm, a mix of jazz, industrial smoke, and the constant low murmur of secrets whispered in shadowed alleys. For every shining skyscraper, there were 10 tenements where ambition collided with desperation. Immigrants poured into the city in waves, carrying dreams as large as the harbor they arrived through, but also the burdens of poverty, prejudice, and the struggle for survival. It was a city of stark contrasts, a place where opportunity and menace existed side by side, and nowhere was this duality more apparent than in the underworld that thrived beneath the neon lights. The city's criminal networks were fractured, chaotic, and often brutal, ruled by older, entrenched families who wielded power through fear and tradition. Violence was as common as a handshake, and betrayal was always just a step behind loyalty. Into this maelstrom of ambition and danger stepped a young man who would become one of the most notorious figures of the American underworld, Lucky Luciano. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano did not inherit power through family ties or tradition. He crafted it, piece by piece, street by street. His presence alone seemed to shift the balance of tension in a room, calm yet dangerous, calculating yet magnetic. To understand the scale of his influence, one must first grasp the state of the city he sought to dominate, a place where rival gangs bled each other dry in the endless pursuit of territory and profit, and where law enforcement, underfunded and often corrupt, struggled to contain the chaos. Luciano's rise would not be sudden or simplistic. It was forged in the crucible of hardship, shaped by the harsh streets of Lower Manhattan, and tempered by a sharp intelligence and relentless ambition. He observed, learned, and adapted, turning street knowledge into strategy and survival instincts into power. He was both a product of the environment and a force that would reshape it. While others relied solely on muscle, Luciano understood the importance of organization, foresight, and alliances, tools that would allow him not just to survive but to dominate. In the dimly lit back rooms of speakeasies and gambling dens, deals were struck in whispers, alliances forged over smoke-filled tables, and threats hung in the air like fog. Luciano moved through these spaces with ease, understanding the delicate balance of fear and respect that governed the underworld. He could charm a rival one moment and strike ruthlessly the next, navigating a world where a single misstep could be fatal. His genius lay not only in recognizing opportunity but in creating it, identifying weaknesses in his enemies, predicting their moves, and bending the chaos around him to his own advantage. The era was defined by prohibition, a time when alcohol was illegal yet demand soared, giving rise to lucrative opportunities for those daring enough to seize them. Bootlegging became the lifeblood of the criminal economy, and Luciano recognized the enormous potential in consolidating operations, rather than waging constant, bloody wars. While others clung to old rivalries and personal grudges, he saw the value in order, efficiency, and cooperation, principles that would eventually allow him to construct a criminal empire unlike anything the city had ever seen. But beyond the streets and speakeasies, there was also a human dimension to his rise. Lucky Luciano was not invincible, nor was he a simple caricature of villainy. He was shaped by fear, ambition, and the raw need to survive in a city that offered little mercy to the weak. His choices, often ruthless, reflected a calculated understanding of the delicate dance between power and vulnerability. He learned early that trust was a commodity, loyalty a rare currency, and betrayal a constant threat. Every move was measured, every alliance scrutinized, and every risk weighed against potential gain. In many ways, the story of Luciano is inseparable from the story of New York itself, a city of dreams shadowed by danger, where ambition collided with survival at every turn. It is in this tension that his legend begins, in a world of contrasts where the bright lights of opportunity illuminate the darkness of treachery. His journey was not just a personal ascent, it was a transformation of the underworld itself, a reshaping of power that would echo for decades. And as the first notes of his story unfold, one thing becomes clear. To understand Lucky Luciano is to understand the hidden wars, the whispered alliances, and the relentless pursuit of power that defined a generation of organized crime. Before Lucky Luciano rose to prominence, the criminal underworld of New York was a fractured landscape, a chaotic battlefield of competing gangs and families, each claiming their own territory with little regard for order or cooperation. The streets were controlled not by strategy or vision but by brute force, intimidation, and the old codes of Sicilian tradition. Violence was the language of power, and loyalty was often fleeting, determined more by fear than trust. Gang leaders ruled their neighborhoods like small, warring kingdoms, engaging in turf battles that spilled into the streets with little thought for the consequences beyond immediate survival and profit. The city's criminal hierarchy was rigid yet fragile, bound by tradition but constantly under threat from ambitious outsiders or even internal dissent. Established bosses relied heavily on muscle and reputation, often resisting innovation, unwilling to bend or adapt to a rapidly changing world. These leaders were both revered and feared, but their power was unstable, vulnerable to the rise of a new kind of mind. Someone capable of seeing beyond the next street fight, someone who could envision the larger structure of control. Luciano's contemporaries were excellent soldiers, fearless in combat, but poor strategists. They did not see the potential of turning chaos into coordinated enterprise. This era was also marked by a violent generational struggle. Older mobsters clung to Sicilian customs, operating under the belief that honor and tradition were paramount, while younger criminals began to embrace pragmatism and ambition over heritage. Conflicts erupted not only between rival families but also within them, as ambitious lieutenants tested their strength against aging bosses. The result was a city constantly on edge, with power shifting unpredictably, and the line between friend and enemy perpetually blurred. It was an environment where trust was a liability, and survival demanded constant vigilance. New York itself amplified the chaos. Immigrant communities were densely packed and tightly interwoven, with neighborhoods like Little Italy and the Lower East Side acting as both sanctuary and prison. Within these microcosms, gangs could operate with a degree of impunity, drawing on the loyalty of residents who relied on them for protection, work, or basic services. Yet this loyalty was often conditional, fragile, and easily tested. Law enforcement struggled to contain crime, frequently outmatched, underpaid, or corrupt, allowing the underworld to flourish in plain sight. Political machines like Tammany Hall were entangled in the fabric of crime, accepting bribes and favors, which only added to the complexity of the city's criminal ecosystem. The chaos was punctuated by high-profile gang wars that made headlines and filled morgues alike. Shootouts in narrow alleys, murders in broad daylight, and brazen kidnappings were common occurrences, each incident a stark reminder that the city had no real order. While some gang leaders sought temporary truces to consolidate power, these arrangements were fragile, dissolving as quickly as they formed. The underworld's instability created openings for someone like Luciano, who could recognize the inefficiency and exploit it. He understood that these constant wars were self-destructive and that unifying operations under a single, structured system would not only reduce unnecessary bloodshed but also dramatically increase profits. Amid this turbulence, the public perception of the Mafia was both fascination and fear. Stories of mob violence and corruption spread through newspapers, sensationalized yet grounded in the brutal reality of everyday life. These narratives created an aura of myth around the gangs, elevating their leaders to a near-legendary status while obscuring the inner mechanics of their operations. To the outside world, power was raw and violent. Inside, it was increasingly strategic, a chessboard where careful planning could outweigh brute strength. Luciano, observing these dynamics, saw the potential to bridge the gap between myth and method, chaos and order. Yet the city's underworld was not solely a playground for ambition. It was also a pressure cooker of personal vendettas, shifting alliances, and moral ambiguity. Rivalries were fueled by pride, revenge, and greed, often erupting without warning and claiming lives indiscriminately. Every neighborhood had its own informal hierarchy, and every act of violence risked sparking broader conflict. For the average gangster, survival was an art of reading people, understanding intentions, and anticipating betrayal. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to not only navigate this treacherous terrain but also to manipulate it to his advantage, leveraging fear, loyalty, and the human desire for security to build influence where others relied solely on intimidation. The fractured state of the Mafia before Luciano's ascendancy makes his later accomplishments even more remarkable. He entered a world where power was short-lived, trust was scarce, and alliances were fragile. By studying this chaos, he recognized the limitations of the old order and envisioned a system that could consolidate power, maximize profits, and reduce internal conflict. In doing so, he transformed the underworld from a patchwork of warring factions into a disciplined, strategic enterprise. Understanding this pre-Luciano environment is essential to comprehending both the scale of his ambition and the boldness of his methods, which would ultimately reshape the criminal landscape of New York and beyond. In essence, the New York underworld before Luciano was a kingdom of instability, where violence dictated outcomes and strategy was an afterthought. It was a world perfectly poised for revolution, ripe for a mind capable of seeing opportunity amid chaos, a leader who could turn fear into order and violence into enterprise. Luciano's rise, therefore, was not merely a story of personal ambition. It was the culmination of a profound transformation in how crime was conceived, organized, and executed, a transformation that would leave an indelible mark on the city and the criminal world at large. Luciano's story begins not in the lavish halls of power, but in the crowded, chaotic streets of Lower Manhattan, where the clash of cultures, poverty, and ambition created a crucible for survival. Born in Sicily in 1897 and brought to New York as a child, he arrived in a city alive with both opportunity and danger. The immigrant neighborhoods were bustling yet oppressive, filled with families clinging to old traditions while navigating a new, often hostile environment. Life was unforgiving, and for a young boy like Salvatore Lucania, who would later be known as Lucky Luciano, every moment was a lesson in adaptability, strategy, and observation. From the beginning he understood the rules of survival. Respect must be earned, weakness is exploited, and opportunities must be seized before others recognize them. The streets of East Harlem and the Lower East Side offered both peril and education. Violence was omnipresent, from the knife fights over petty theft to gang skirmishes for control of neighborhoods. But Luciano possessed a unique intelligence that allowed him to see patterns where others only saw chaos. He noticed which fights were worth joining, which rivals could be befriended or manipulated, and which opportunities could be leveraged to climb the social and criminal ladder. Early brushes with the law and minor arrests did not deter him. Instead, they hardened his resolve, sharpening his instincts and teaching him that fear and respect were interchangeable currencies in a world that demanded cunning above all else. Unlike many of his peers, Luciano combined street smarts with an innate charm. He could command attention without raising suspicion, listening as much as he spoke, gauging the ambitions and weaknesses of everyone around him. He quickly learned that influence was not built solely on force. It was built on perception, loyalty, and strategic alliances. In a neighborhood crowded with ambitious youths vying for recognition, Luciano distinguished himself not through brute strength alone but through a calculated blend of intellect, charisma, and a willingness to take calculated risks. These qualities would become the foundation of his later success, allowing him to navigate complex networks of loyalty and betrayal with uncanny skill. His teenage years were marked by petty crimes that gradually escalated into more organized ventures. Luciano experimented with theft, extortion, and gambling, each step a lesson in human behavior and risk management. Every arrest, every narrow escape, and every negotiation taught him how to read people, predict actions, and manipulate circumstances. Unlike many who faltered under pressure, he thrived in environments where the stakes were high, where one misstep could mean death or imprisonment. In this crucible of survival, Luciano's understanding of human nature deepened. He grasped the subtle balance between fear and loyalty, knowing instinctively when to intimidate, when to charm, and when to eliminate threats quietly but decisively. Family ties also played a critical role in shaping him. Though he grew up in a traditional Sicilian household, the values of obedience and honor often clashed with the harsh realities of American life. Luciano learned early that rigid adherence to tradition could be a liability in the face of a rapidly changing world. Observing his elders, he saw the limitations of relying solely on inherited authority or unchallenged respect. Instead, he adopted a pragmatic approach, blending elements of his heritage with the ruthless efficiency required to navigate New York's underworld. This hybrid mindset, traditional values tempered by modern strategy, would later define his leadership style, making him both respected and feared by allies and rivals alike. Education in the streets was brutal but instructive. Luciano encountered figures who embodied the extremes of power and violence, individuals who would shape his understanding of control and ambition. Mentors and rivals alike offered lessons in negotiation, intimidation, and strategy, each interaction a microcosm of the larger world he sought to dominate. The early 1910s and 1920s were a time of experimentation, as Luciano tested boundaries, formed early alliances, and began to envision the possibility of a criminal enterprise governed not by chaos but by order and method. Each gamble, each confrontation, each fleeting victory honed his ability to think several moves ahead, to anticipate the desires and fears of those around him. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, presented a transformative opportunity for Luciano. The ban on alcohol created an underground economy of immense scale, and while other gangsters focused on brute force control of speakeasies and liquor routes, Luciano saw the potential for a systematic, organized approach. He recognized that consolidating operations, forming strategic alliances, and implementing disciplined structures could generate far greater wealth and power than random acts of violence. In effect, he began thinking like a businessman as much as a criminal, calculating profits, risks, and loyalties with precision. By the time he reached his early 20s, Luciano had already begun to distinguish himself from his peers. He was not simply a street fighter or petty criminal. He was an emerging strategist, a man capable of envisioning a larger network, a hierarchy that could channel ambition into controlled, profitable outcomes. His ability to blend charm, intelligence, and ruthlessness made him both approachable and feared, a dangerous combination in a world where miscalculations were often fatal. The young street kid had begun to transform into a figure of authority, capable of challenging established bosses and reshaping the rules of engagement in the criminal underworld. Luciano's early years demonstrate the interplay between environment, ambition, and intelligence. He was shaped by poverty, violence, and the chaotic streets of immigrant New York, yet he transcended them through observation, cunning, and calculated risk-taking. His experiences in these formative years, learning when to strike, when to negotiate, and when to step back, would lay the foundation for his future role as the architect of modern organized crime. In essence, Luciano's rise was not just about seizing opportunity, it was about understanding the machinery of power, human psychology, and the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, lessons that would define the empire he was destined to build. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had transformed from a street-smart, ambitious youth into a figure whose intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness marked him as a future power broker. But raw talent alone was not enough to dominate the fractured New York underworld. What set Luciano apart was his vision, the audacity to imagine a criminal enterprise not as a chaotic battlefield of warring factions but as a coordinated, efficient system. He understood that true power lay not in sheer violence, but in organization, influence, and the ability to manipulate loyalty. This insight would become the cornerstone of his revolution, reshaping the Mafia from a collection of violent gangs into a structured, strategic empire. Luciano's first steps toward this transformation involved carefully cultivating alliances with the right people. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed every relationship through the lens of immediate gain or rivalry, Luciano thought in networks. He recognized potential in individuals who could complement his own strengths, men who brought financial acumen, muscle, or political connections, and he offered them a vision of power and profit that exceeded anything their fragmented factions could offer. Figures like Meyer Lansky with his financial genius and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, with his audacious courage, became trusted collaborators, each drawn to Luciano's clarity of purpose and relentless ambition. Together, they began laying the foundation for a new kind of criminal organization, one that relied as much on planning and strategy as it did on intimidation and violence. Central to this vision was the creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to arbitrate disputes, oversee operations, and maintain order among the various Mafia families. While the idea of such a council might seem obvious in retrospect, in the violent, tradition-bound world of the 1920s, it was revolutionary. Luciano recognized that the endless cycle of bloodshed, gang wars over territory, honor, and petty grievances, was inefficient and ultimately destructive. By instituting a system in which families could collaborate rather than constantly compete, he not only reduced unnecessary violence but also increased profitability and stability. The Commission represented a radical shift. Power could be shared, disputes could be regulated, and ambition could be channeled in a controlled manner. But building this empire required more than structural innovation. It required the ability to neutralize opponents while winning their cooperation, or at least their acquiescence. Luciano approached this challenge with a combination of strategy, psychology, and calculated ruthlessness. He carefully studied the older generation of bosses, noting their strengths, weaknesses, and inflexibilities. Joe Masuria, for example, wielded immense authority through fear but lacked adaptability, while Salvatore Maranzano was rigid, hierarchical, and deeply invested in old-world traditions. Luciano understood that defeating them would require patience, alliances, and precise timing. Rather than attacking directly, he cultivated relationships with disaffected lieutenants, nurtured dissent, and exploited divisions from within. His ability to maneuver behind the scenes, often invisible to his rivals, exemplified a new approach to power. Subtle, strategic, and relentlessly focused on the long game. The rise of Luciano also marked a shift in how the Mafia interacted with the wider world. Whereas previous leaders operated largely in isolation, relying on localized influence, Luciano recognized the benefits of integration with legitimate structures and political networks. He understood that corruption and influence extended beyond the streets into unions, local government, and law enforcement. By strategically positioning allies within these spheres, he created a protective buffer that allowed his operations to thrive with reduced interference. Speakeasies, gambling halls, and labor rackets were no longer just tools of illicit profit. They became instruments of influence, extending Luciano's reach into multiple facets of city life. This blending of criminal and legitimate enterprise was a hallmark of his innovative approach, and it fundamentally altered the balance of power in New York's underworld. Luciano's methods were not purely cerebral. They were reinforced by a careful, selective application of violence. Unlike his predecessors who often resorted to unthinking brutality, Luciano used violence as a precise instrument, strategically deployed to eliminate threats, intimidate rivals, or send clear messages. The assassinations during the Castellamarese War, for instance, were not random acts of vengeance but calculated moves designed to destabilize opposition, consolidate allies, and signal the emergence of a new order. In this way, fear became a tool, not an end in itself, subordinated to a broader strategy of power consolidation. This approach demonstrated Luciano's understanding of human psychology. People could be motivated by fear, loyalty, or ambition, but the key to control was knowing which levers to pull and when. Equally important was Luciano's ability to adapt and innovate. He rejected the old-world rigidity of Sicilian tradition when it conflicted with practical results, yet he retained the strategic lessons embedded within those traditions: loyalty, secrecy, and respect for hierarchy. By blending old and new approaches, he created a hybrid model of organized crime that was both disciplined and flexible. His operations were compartmentalized with specialized roles and responsibilities, yet the overarching control remained centralized through his leadership and the commission. This balance of autonomy and oversight allowed his network to expand rapidly without losing cohesion, a feat unmatched by any predecessor. Luciano's empire building also emphasized the importance of perception and reputation. He cultivated an image that commanded respect even among his enemies, projecting an aura of inevitability and authority. Yet he was careful never to appear infallible, understanding that humility and occasional strategic concessions could defuse potential rivals and cement loyalty. The perception of invincibility, combined with calculated displays of pragmatism, created a psychological dominance that extended his influence far beyond the immediate reach of his operations. People began to understand that Luciano was not simply another gang leader. He was a visionary, a strategist capable of seeing and shaping the broader patterns of power. By the late 1920s, the transformation was undeniable. The Mafia was no longer a loose collection of violent factions. It had become a structured, hierarchical organization capable of unprecedented coordination and profit. Luciano's model, strategic alliances, compartmentalized operations, calculated use of violence, and integration with legitimate society, set a standard that would define organized crime for decades. His genius lay not in brute force but in the combination of vision, strategy, and psychology. He turned chaos into order, fear into leverage, and ambition into a coordinated, empire-building enterprise. The era of the unorganized, chaotic gangster was ending, and in its place the modern American Mafia was emerging. Luciano was the architect of this transformation, reshaping not only New York's criminal landscape but the very rules by which power and influence were exercised in the underworld. His methods, ambitious and ruthless, represented a revolution in both organization and mentality. The criminal empire could be disciplined, sophisticated, and sustainable. Through foresight, alliances, and relentless innovation, Luciano demonstrated that leadership in the underworld was not merely a matter of intimidation. It was a matter of vision, strategy, and the ability to manipulate both people and circumstances with precision. Central to the power and influence of Luciano's empire was a principle older than the streets of New York itself: the Code of Omerta. This was not merely a set of rules. It was a philosophy, a binding framework that governed behavior, loyalty, and silence within the criminal world. To outsiders, the Mafia appeared as a network of gangs, families, and violent men, but at its core lay a rigid moral and psychological order, a code that dictated who could be trusted, who could be confronted, and who must be feared. Omerta was both a shield and a weapon, a system that protected the organization from the eyes of the law while simultaneously controlling the behavior of those within it. Without understanding this code, the genius of Luciano's rise cannot be fully appreciated. Omerta demanded absolute silence in the face of legal authority, a commitment to secrecy so profound that even under threat of death or imprisonment, betrayal was considered the ultimate sin. To speak to outsiders about the organization's operations, alliances, or internal disputes was a crime in itself, punishable often by death. This unyielding loyalty created a culture where trust became the most valuable currency, and fear was the mechanism by which it was maintained. Luciano's brilliance was in understanding how to leverage this psychological system. Loyalty could be rewarded, betrayal punished, and perception managed in a way that consolidated his power without constant displays of brute force. But Omerta was not merely about obedience, it was about identity. For members of the Mafia, adherence to the code was a rite of passage, a defining element of belonging to a brotherhood that demanded both respect and self-sacrifice. The promise of protection, shared profit, and status created strong incentives to comply, while the ever-present threat of violent retribution enforced conformity. Luciano recognized that controlling a network of ambitious and often ruthless men required more than threats. It required embedding the rules of loyalty into the very psychology of his associates. By institutionalizing fear and mutual obligation, he transformed potential rivals into collaborators and reduced the chaos that had plagued the underworld before his ascendancy. The code also defined the moral landscape of the Mafia, establishing a clear distinction between insiders and outsiders. Betrayal was not merely disloyalty, it was a violation of sacred law, a transgression that destabilized the delicate hierarchy upon which the organization relied. Conversely, courage, resourcefulness, and adherence to Omerta were celebrated, reinforcing the idea that respect and reputation were earned through conduct aligned with the organization's principles. Luciano understood that these values could be manipulated strategically. By rewarding loyalty and punishing defection with careful precision, he created a psychological system that ensured compliance, even among those with ambitions that might otherwise challenge his authority. Luciano's application of the code went beyond simple enforcement. He used it as a tool to shape alliances and control information, knowing that knowledge was power. Those who possessed secrets were both assets and threats, and he cultivated an environment where strategic disclosure and concealment could be wielded as instruments of influence. The very uncertainty of the code, who could be trusted, who might break it, kept his underlings attentive, obedient, and dependent on his guidance. In effect, Luciano weaponized Omerta, turning the internal culture of silence and loyalty into a mechanism for centralized control that amplified his personal authority without exposing him unnecessarily to direct conflict. The psychological impact of Omerta extended beyond individual relationships to the organization as a whole. It created a network in which each member was both a participant and an observer, constantly evaluating the loyalty of those around them while understanding their own vulnerability. This self-policing structure ensured that power remained concentrated in the hands of those capable of enforcing it, and it minimized the risk of exposure or internal fracture. Luciano's genius was in recognizing that fear could be systematized, loyalty institutionalized, and silence weaponized, not through random acts of brutality, but through disciplined, predictable application of the organization's rules. Yet the code also carried profound moral ambiguity. While it preserved order, it demanded the sacrifice of conscience, personal ambition, and sometimes even human life. To outsiders, this could appear as cold-blooded pragmatism. To insiders, it was a matter of survival, honor, and identity. Luciano navigated this moral landscape with exceptional skill. He was ruthless when necessary but measured, enforcing Omerta in a way that preserved both stability and loyalty. By mastering the psychology of obedience and fear, he ensured that the organization's members acted in concert with his vision, even when their own interests might have dictated otherwise. In practical terms, Omerta allowed Luciano to coordinate complex operations across multiple families and territories. Information flowed only as necessary, decisions were centralized, and the potential for rogue actors was minimized. This discipline gave his organization a competitive edge over rival gangs that remained fractured, impulsive, and reactive. Where other leaders relied solely on intimidation or brute strength, Luciano relied on structure, perception, and psychological leverage. The Code of Omerta became not just a defensive mechanism but a strategic instrument, enabling the creation of an empire that could expand, endure, and adapt in ways that older, tradition-bound criminal networks could not. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta was a mirror of Luciano himself, disciplined, strategic, and ruthless, yet deeply aware of human psychology. It reflected his understanding that true control was not achieved through fear alone, but through a careful balance of incentive, threat, and perception. By mastering this balance, he created a system that amplified his power, limited dissent, and allowed him to dominate the criminal landscape with precision and subtlety. The genius of Luciano was not simply in seizing opportunity, but in shaping the very rules of the game, embedding loyalty and obedience into the hearts and minds of those around him, and ensuring that the organization remained resilient even under extraordinary pressure. Omerta was more than a rule, it was the backbone of the modern mafia, a psychological framework that ensured survival, enforced loyalty, and maintained order in a world defined by danger and betrayal. For Luciano, understanding and manipulating this code was as important as any gun or alliance, because it allowed him to govern a complex, volatile empire with subtlety and foresight. It was through mastery of omerta that he could transform raw ambition into structured power, and chaos into a disciplined, coordinated network capable of unprecedented influence. In this way, the code was both shield and sword, a central pillar in the architecture of his criminal empire and a testament to the strategic mind of the man who would forever change the American underworld. While loyalty and fear were the invisible threads that held Luciano's empire together, money was the engine that powered it. From the earliest days of his rise, Luciano understood that control over profitable enterprises was the key to consolidating power, and he approached criminal activity with the mindset of a businessman rather than a mere thug. Unlike earlier mobsters whose activities were reactive and localized, Luciano saw opportunity in scale, organization, and diversification. The streets of New York offered more than violence and intimidation. They offered a complex, lucrative ecosystem of illicit markets waiting for someone with vision, discipline, and strategic acumen to harness them. Prohibition created a seismic shift in the American underworld. The nationwide ban on alcohol transformed ordinary citizens into potential clients and speakeasies into high-demand businesses, generating immense profits for those who controlled supply. Luciano recognized early that this was not a moment for random raids or brute force control. It was an opportunity to systematize distribution, standardize operations, and build networks that could endure. By partnering with influential figures across multiple neighborhoods and families, he orchestrated a supply chain that stretched across the city, ensuring that alcohol flowed consistently while minimizing the conflicts that had previously decimated rival gangs. In this way, Luciano demonstrated a prescient understanding of market dynamics, risk management, and strategic collaboration long before such concepts were formally defined in business textbooks. Yet bootlegging was only the beginning. Luciano's operations extended into gambling, an industry as lucrative as it was socially embedded. Illegal gaming halls became a source of both revenue and influence, attracting patrons from the upper and lower strata of society. Luciano understood that control over gambling was more than money, it was leverage. These venues provided information, alliances, and a steady cash flow, creating opportunities to exert influence over politicians, law enforcement, and rival factions. Each poker table, dice game, and betting hall was simultaneously a financial asset and a strategic instrument, a microcosm of the empire he was constructing. Labor rackets were another pillar of Luciano's growing network. By infiltrating unions and strategically positioning allies in key positions, he gained both economic control and political influence. Strikes, labor disputes, and union negotiations could be orchestrated to his advantage, generating both direct profit and indirect leverage over the city's commercial and industrial sectors. The ability to manipulate labor demonstrated a level of sophistication rarely seen in criminal enterprises of the era. Luciano was not merely exploiting opportunities, he was actively reshaping the mechanisms of power, blending legal structures with illicit influence to create a hybrid model of control. Prostitution and vice operations further diversified his portfolio. These ventures were lucrative, socially pervasive, and difficult for law enforcement to eradicate entirely. Luciano approached them with a combination of discretion and strategic brutality, ensuring that operations ran smoothly while protecting his network from external threats. He carefully calibrated the risks and rewards, understanding that unchecked violence or mismanagement could attract unwanted attention and jeopardize the entire enterprise. In this sense, Luciano's approach resembled that of a corporate executive, managing assets, assessing risk, and optimizing operations for maximum gain. Crucial to the success of these enterprises was Luciano's ability to combine autonomy with oversight. Local managers and lieutenants were empowered to operate with a degree of independence, but strategic decisions, critical information, and sensitive operations remained under centralized control. This compartmentalization minimized the risk of exposure or betrayal while ensuring that resources and profits were channeled efficiently. Luciano's network was in essence a disciplined machine, each part operating according to defined roles, yet all aligned toward a singular goal: profit, influence, and consolidation of power. Financial acumen alone, however, could not sustain such an empire. Luciano understood that control over markets required both respect and fear. Competitors who threatened his operations were either absorbed, neutralized, or eliminated, while allies were rewarded with shares of profit, protection, and status. He meticulously calculated every decision, balancing short-term gains against long-term stability, always aware that the delicate equilibrium of alliances and rivalries could shift with the smallest misstep. Violence and diplomacy were tools in a broader strategy, instruments to be deployed according to circumstance, not reflex. By the late 1920s, Luciano's empire had achieved a scale and sophistication previously unseen in American organized crime. Speakeasies, gambling dens, labor unions, and vice operations formed an interlocking network of revenue and influence. Each component reinforced the others. Profits from bootlegging funded expansion into gambling and vice, while control over labor unions ensured leverage over legitimate businesses and politicians. This interconnected system gave Luciano both financial stability and strategic flexibility. He could absorb setbacks, manipulate rivals, and reinvest resources into new ventures with unprecedented efficiency. Importantly, Luciano's approach transformed public perception as well. Whereas earlier gangsters were often seen as street-level criminals or violent thugs, Luciano's operations projected an image of sophistication, organization, and inevitability. The empire he built was not merely about violence or intimidation. It was about creating a system in which illegal activity was methodical, profitable, and resilient. For those within his network, this demonstrated both the rewards of loyalty and the consequences of defiance. For rivals, it was a clear signal that traditional methods of control were obsolete, and that power now belonged to those capable of thinking strategically, psychologically, and financially. The business of crime under Luciano was, at its core, a study in human behavior and risk management. He understood that profit depended not only on the illegal markets themselves but also on the people who participated in them. Allies, competitors, law enforcement, and customers alike. He mastered the art of negotiation, coercion, and strategic investment, blending opportunity with manipulation to create sustainable advantage. By treating criminal enterprises as disciplined, interconnected operations, he elevated organized crime from a chaotic, reactive system into a sophisticated, self-reinforcing network. In retrospect, the genius of Luciano's business model lies in its integration of psychology, strategy, and finance. He recognized that power without profitability is fleeting, and that profit without control is dangerous. By uniting these elements, he created an empire that not only dominated the New York underworld but also set a precedent for organized crime nationwide. Bootlegging, gambling, labor influence, and vice were not simply sources of income. They were instruments of power, channels through which loyalty, fear, and influence could be systematically exercised. Luciano's approach to crime was revolutionary because it was holistic. It combined vision, discipline, and ruthless pragmatism to create a system capable of enduring both internal conflict and external pressure. Each operation was part of a larger strategy, each alliance a calculated investment, and each act of violence a measured tool rather than a reflexive reaction. By transforming the pursuit of illicit profit into an organized, strategic enterprise, Luciano redefined the possibilities of criminal power, setting the stage for the modern mafia and establishing himself as both an innovator and a master of human and economic manipulation. Even the most meticulously organized empire is only as strong as its alliances, and Luciano understood this principle better than anyone. In the volatile world of the mafia, relationships were rarely straightforward. They were webs of opportunity, mutual interest, and potential betrayal. Every handshake carried the weight of calculation, every conversation concealed strategy, and every gesture of loyalty was scrutinized for hidden motives. For Luciano, alliances were never mere conveniences. They were instruments of power, carefully cultivated and strategically leveraged to consolidate influence, expand operations, and neutralize threats. Yet within this network of cooperation lay an ever-present shadow, the possibility of treachery, the knowledge that a friend today could be an enemy tomorrow. Luciano's rise was facilitated by his uncanny ability to identify potential allies and understand their ambitions. Figures such as Meyer Lansky with his financial brilliance and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel with his fearless audacity became not only partners but extensions of his vision. Luciano understood that in order to reshape the mafia, he needed collaborators who could think strategically, act decisively, and complement his strengths. Together, they formed a core group capable of executing complex operations and navigating the treacherous terrain of New York's underworld. Each ally was selected not only for loyalty but also for skill, temperament, and the ability to manage risk. In this way, Luciano built a network that was simultaneously disciplined and adaptable, a combination that made him nearly untouchable in the early years of his ascendancy. But alliances were fragile. The very environment that demanded loyalty also fostered resentment, jealousy, and ambition. Rival factions constantly tested one another, seeking openings in which to seize power or exploit weakness. Luciano understood that managing these dynamics required constant vigilance, diplomacy, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. He cultivated trust with one hand and held the threat of consequences in the other, ensuring that partners remained loyal while competitors were aware of the potential cost of betrayal. This dual approach, rewarding loyalty and punishing treachery, created a psychological balance that allowed him to maintain authority without relying solely on force. The threat of betrayal was never hypothetical. Within the Mafia, ambitions ran high and loyalty was conditional. Even close allies could be swayed by promises of wealth, power, or revenge. Luciano navigated these tensions with a combination of foresight and manipulation. He created interdependencies among his associates, ensuring that each member had something to lose if the network fractured. By controlling the flow of information, resources, and opportunity, he made it more profitable for allies to remain loyal than to defect. The result was a network bound not only by shared interest but by carefully orchestrated mutual dependence, a system that both strengthened the organization and protected Luciano's position at its center. Treachery, however, could never be eliminated entirely. As Luciano consolidated power, rival bosses grew increasingly wary of his methods and vision. The Castellamarese War, a brutal conflict between rival factions, exemplified the lethal consequences of broken alliances. Traditional leaders like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano relied on fear and reputation, expecting obedience through intimidation alone. Luciano, by contrast, employed strategy, patience, and selective violence. He cultivated dissent within enemy ranks, turning ambitious lieutenants against their leaders and exploiting divisions that others failed to see. By manipulating the human dynamics of ambition and loyalty, he weakened his rivals from within, demonstrating that the most powerful weapon in his arsenal was not a gun or knife, but understanding and controlling the ambitions of others. The psychological dimension of alliances extended beyond individual relationships. Luciano understood the symbolic power of public displays of cooperation and unity. When rival factions met under his mediation, the appearance of order reinforced his authority and created the perception that resistance was futile. At the same time, these gatherings allowed him to observe subtle cues, gestures, glances, and tone that hinted at potential disloyalty or ambition. By reading people as carefully as he read markets or territories, Luciano transformed social interaction into a strategic tool, extracting both information and compliance. Yet alliances were not solely for offense, they were defensive as well. Luciano used partnerships to create buffers against threats, both internal and external. By distributing influence among trusted associates and carefully managing rivalries, he reduced the likelihood of direct attacks on himself while maximizing the organization's reach. Allies served as both shields and instruments, their loyalty reinforcing his authority and ensuring that power was concentrated where he could exercise it most effectively. This dual function of alliances, as both protective and proactive mechanisms, demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of organizational dynamics, psychological leverage, and strategic risk. The tension between loyalty and betrayal also shaped the culture of the organization. Allies were constantly reminded of the consequences of disloyalty, but they were also rewarded for initiative, effectiveness, and faithfulness. This balance of fear and incentive created a disciplined yet motivated workforce, capable of executing complex operations while remaining psychologically attuned to the hierarchy. Luciano's ability to maintain this equilibrium was a defining feature of his leadership and a key factor in his unprecedented consolidation of power. Ultimately, the interplay of alliances and treachery was a defining feature of Luciano's empire. By carefully selecting allies, orchestrating dependencies, and managing rivalries with precision, he created a network that could endure both internal conflict and external pressure. His understanding of human nature, the motivations, fears, and ambitions of those around him, allowed him to manipulate relationships as skillfully as he manipulated markets or territories. In this world, loyalty was a commodity, treachery a constant threat, and power belonged to those who could navigate the delicate balance between them. Through this lens, Luciano's genius emerges not merely as organizational or financial, but as profoundly psychological. He understood that influence is rarely absolute, that authority depends on perception, and that every relationship carries both potential benefit and risk. By mastering the dynamics of alliances and treachery, he transformed the Mafia into a disciplined, adaptive, and highly resilient organization. His network was not simply a collection of men. It was a system of interlocking ambitions, fears, and obligations, each element carefully calibrated to reinforce his authority and advance his vision. In the volatile world of organized crime, where betrayal could strike at any moment, Luciano's ability to navigate alliances with precision was perhaps his greatest strength. He created stability out of chaos, loyalty out of ambition, and influence out of fear, forging a criminal empire that was both disciplined and expansive. In doing so, he demonstrated that the true power of the Mafia was not merely in violence or intimidation, but in the mastery of human relationships. The ability to inspire, manipulate, and control those around him with a combination of strategy, foresight, and psychological acuity. Even as Luciano's empire solidified, the world around him remained volatile, a hidden battlefield where threats lurked in shadows and conflicts simmered beneath the surface. This was a war unseen by the public, a chess game of strategy, manipulation, and violence where each move could alter the balance of power. Rival families, discontented lieutenants, ambitious outsiders, and law enforcement created a tense environment in which survival demanded constant vigilance. Luciano had learned that true control required more than overt dominance. It required foresight, subtlety, and an almost instinctual understanding of human behavior. This hidden war was not fought in broad daylight with guns blazing, but in whispers, betrayals, clandestine meetings, and meticulously calculated strikes. The Castellammarese War, which raged in the late 1920s and early 1930s, epitomized this invisible battlefield. Two factions, the forces of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, vied for supremacy in New York, each seeking to impose order through intimidation and violence. For the uninitiated, it appeared as a chaotic struggle between gangs. For Luciano, it was an opportunity to reshape the underworld according to his vision. He studied the conflict carefully, identifying the weaknesses, ambitions, and fractures within both sides. Rather than committing prematurely, he played a delicate game of deception and strategic alliance, positioning himself as both a mediator and a force capable of decisive action when the moment was right. Luciano's approach to this hidden war was profoundly psychological. He understood that loyalty could be manipulated, that ambition could be redirected, and that fear could be weaponized. By subtly influencing lieutenants, nurturing dissent within enemy ranks, and orchestrating betrayals at critical moments, he destabilized opponents from within. It was a war fought not only with guns but with intellect, patience, and the careful deployment of violence to achieve maximum strategic impact. Every assassination, every whispered threat, and every secret meeting was calculated to shift power in his favor while minimizing unnecessary risk to his own network. The stakes were extraordinarily high. One misstep, a misjudged alliance, a premature strike, or a disclosure of weakness, could trigger a cascade of retaliation, threatening not only Luciano himself but the intricate web of relationships and operations he had built. Yet the hidden war demanded more than caution, it demanded boldness. Luciano recognized that decisive action was essential to survival and ultimate dominance. In moments of crisis, he combined audacity with precision, orchestrating strikes that eliminated key rivals while simultaneously consolidating alliances and enhancing his reputation for strategic brilliance. The balance between patience and action was delicate, and it was in this tension that Luciano's genius as both strategist and tactician became most evident. Law enforcement added another dimension to the hidden war. Police, federal agents, and political entities applied pressure inconsistently, often influenced by corruption, public opinion, or competing interests. This unpredictability forced Luciano to navigate multiple fronts simultaneously, balancing the need for operational secrecy with the need to maintain influence over allies and adversaries alike. His understanding of these dynamics allowed him to exploit weaknesses, negotiate covert agreements, and even manipulate legal pressures to eliminate rivals without exposing himself or his core network to undue risk. In this way, the hidden war was not only a struggle between gangs but a multidimensional conflict involving every lever of power available in New York. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. Every decision carried the weight of potential betrayal and violence. Every alliance was tempered by uncertainty. Every success was shadowed by the possibility of immediate reprisal. Luciano's ability to maintain composure, calculate risk, and predict human behavior under these pressures distinguished him from his contemporaries. While others reacted impulsively or relied solely on intimidation, he operated with the patience and precision of a chess master, seeing multiple moves ahead and anticipating the ambitions and fears of every player on the board. The hidden war also extended to territory and influence. Control over neighborhoods, unions, speakeasies, and gambling operations was contested not only through overt force but through subtler forms of manipulation. Luciano used intermediaries, negotiations, and threats to secure critical positions, often neutralizing opposition before they even realized they were under attack. In this way, the war was fought simultaneously in the streets, in offices, and in private parlors, blending strategy, diplomacy, and violence into a single, cohesive campaign. The ability to synchronize these fronts was a hallmark of Luciano's leadership and a key factor in his consolidation of power. At the same time, the hidden war highlighted the importance of timing. Luciano understood that an advantage seized too early could provoke premature retaliation, while hesitation could result in lost opportunity. This delicate calculus extended to every element of his operations: assassinations, alliances, financial maneuvers, and political interventions. Each move was weighed for immediate impact and long-term consequence, and Luciano's decisions were guided by a combination of intelligence, observation, and instinct honed on the streets of New York. The hidden war was as much about anticipation and preparation as it was about action, and Luciano's mastery of this balance allowed him to emerge victorious while many of his contemporaries were destroyed by miscalculation. The result of this hidden war was a transformation of the Mafia itself. By exploiting internal fractures, forging strategic alliances, and neutralizing rivals with precision, Luciano consolidated power and created the conditions for a new order. The chaotic, violent landscape of the pre-Luciano underworld gave way to a structured, disciplined, and highly profitable network. While the public remained largely unaware of the mechanisms behind this transformation, those within the organization recognized Luciano's brilliance and feared the consequences of defying him. He had turned the hidden war, a landscape of constant threat, betrayal, and uncertainty, into a tool for empire building, using the chaos of conflict as a foundation for order and control. In many ways, the hidden war was not a single event but an ongoing condition of power. Even as his empire grew, Luciano remained vigilant, aware that threats, both internal and external, were ever present. The genius of his approach lay in his ability to integrate the lessons of conflict into a sustainable system of influence. Alliances carefully managed, loyalty enforced through psychological and practical means, and rivals neutralized without destabilizing the broader organization. This multidimensional approach to warfare, simultaneously strategic, psychological, and operational, ensured that Luciano remained not only a survivor but the dominant force in New York's underworld. Ultimately, the hidden war reveals the complexity and sophistication of Luciano's rise. It was not a story of simple violence or luck, but of careful observation, strategic manipulation, and decisive action. By mastering the interplay of loyalty, betrayal, risk, and timing, he transformed a fractured criminal landscape into a disciplined, profitable empire. The hidden war was the crucible in which his genius was forged, a battle fought not just with weapons, but with minds, alliances, and strategy. It was a war that only the shrewdest and most daring could survive, and in which Luciano emerged indisputably as the victor. Even the most cunning and powerful empires are vulnerable to cracks, and Luciano's was no exception. Despite his brilliance in orchestrating alliances, neutralizing rivals, and managing a complex criminal enterprise, the forces of law, luck, and betrayal began converging against him in the early 1930s. The fall of an underworld titan often begins quietly, in overlooked vulnerabilities, and Luciano's empire was suddenly exposed to scrutiny, internal resentment, and political pressure. The hidden war he had navigated with such skill now intersected with a very public threat, a legal system increasingly determined to dismantle organized crime. This was the beginning of a chapter that would test not only his intellect but also the resilience of the empire he had built. The seeds of Luciano's downfall were planted long before his arrest. While he had mastered loyalty and enforced omerta with precision, the human element, ambition, greed, and fear, remained unpredictable. Associates who had once been loyal began to see opportunities to improve their own standing, sometimes at Luciano's expense. Meanwhile, law enforcement, emboldened by public outrage over violence, corruption, and Prohibition-era crime, intensified their focus on the city's underworld. Political figures, seeking public approval, demanded accountability, and new investigative strategies targeted the very networks Luciano had so carefully constructed. The convergence of internal vulnerability and external pressure created a perfect storm, setting the stage for his first major confrontation with the law. The arrest of Luciano was neither sudden nor accidental. Federal agents had been meticulously gathering evidence, tracing his operations, and cultivating informants within his network. The very complexity that had once been his strength, diversified revenue streams, interlocking alliances and compartmentalized operations, now made him a target. Each connection, each transaction, each relationship represented a potential trail for investigators to follow. Luciano's brilliance could only delay the inevitable. No empire, no matter how disciplined, could remain entirely invisible in a world increasingly driven by law enforcement scrutiny and public demand for justice. Betrayal, both overt and subtle, also accelerated his downfall. Some associates, under pressure from the law or motivated by personal gain, began to cooperate with authorities. Others allowed small lapses to occur, providing investigators with the openings they needed. Luciano's careful orchestration of loyalty could not entirely prevent these cracks, and slowly the protective shell of Omerta began to show signs of stress. The psychological calculus that had allowed him to manipulate loyalty was being challenged by forces beyond his direct control. Even a leader as intelligent and strategic as Luciano could not fully account for the unpredictability of human behavior when confronted with coercion, self-preservation, or greed. The arrest itself was a dramatic turning point. It was not merely a legal event, it was a symbolic moment that demonstrated the reach of the state, the vulnerability of even the most powerful figures, and the fragility of criminal empires. Luciano, once untouchable, found himself at the mercy of a system he had long navigated with cunning and discretion. For the underworld, it was a shock. A reminder that no network, no matter how sophisticated, could exist entirely above the law. For Luciano, it was a test of intellect, resolve, and the psychological acumen that had propelled him to the pinnacle of power. Yet even in the face of arrest, Luciano's strategic mind remained active. He began to orchestrate defenses, manage information, and leverage relationships to mitigate the impact on his empire. Lawyers, allies, and intermediaries were mobilized, and every move was calculated to protect both his personal interests and the ongoing operations of his network. However, the reality of the legal system and the growing determination of investigators introduced constraints that no street-born strategy could fully overcome. For the first time, Luciano was confronting the limits of his control, learning that empire building, even a meticulously constructed one, was vulnerable to forces operating beyond the reach of influence, loyalty, or fear. The fall of Luciano was not simply a consequence of law enforcement pressure. It was also the result of accumulated tension, resentment, and ambition within his network. Rivals he had neutralized or manipulated continued to watch, waiting for opportunity. Even trusted lieutenants were faced with choices that could shift the balance of power, creating uncertainty at a time when unity was critical. Luciano's ability to anticipate moves and counteract threats was remarkable, but the convergence of external and internal pressures created conditions that challenged even his exceptional skill. In essence, the fall began as a slow erosion, a combination of legal, personal, and organizational forces steadily tightening around him. This period also highlighted the psychological toll of leadership in a high-stakes, violent world. Luciano, accustomed to directing action, now found himself reacting to circumstances beyond his immediate control. The tension of constantly evaluating threats, calculating risks, and predicting human behavior intensified as the walls of his empire seemed to close in. This phase of his life illustrates a fundamental truth about power. The higher one rises, the greater the scrutiny, the more dangerous the opposition, and the more unforgiving the consequences of miscalculation. Luciano's genius had allowed him to build an empire, but the fall reminded him, and the world, that even the most brilliant minds are vulnerable to convergence of law, betrayal, and circumstance. Ultimately, the beginning of Luciano's fall was both dramatic and instructive. It exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most disciplined criminal enterprise, underscored the limits of loyalty and omerta, and demonstrated the psychological pressures faced by a leader navigating an intricate web of power and ambition. His arrest was not merely a personal crisis, it was a systemic event, one that reverberated throughout the underworld and signaled a shift in the balance of power. The empire he had built was resilient, but it was not immune to disruption, and the coming years would test both its structural integrity and Luciano's ability to adapt under extraordinary pressure. In retrospect, the fall of Luciano was inevitable in some sense, not because of incompetence or naivety, but because empire, no matter how brilliantly constructed, is subject to forces beyond control. Legal scrutiny, human unpredictability, and the relentless ambitions of others converge in ways that even the most strategic leader cannot fully anticipate. The story of Luciano's descent is therefore a cautionary tale, illustrating the fragility of power, the perils of visibility, and the complex interplay between genius, loyalty, and the inexorable reach of law and circumstance. It is the moment when the architect of a modern criminal empire first confronts the harsh reality that no strategy, however sophisticated, can entirely escape the consequences of a world governed by ambition unchecked, and the law. The courtroom became the next battlefield in Luciano's saga, a theater where his intelligence, reputation, and influence would be tested under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. For years, Luciano had navigated the shadows, orchestrating alliances, managing empires, and controlling perception from behind the scenes. Now he was thrust into a world of exposure, where every word, gesture, and glance was observed, dissected, and weaponized. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a clash of narratives, a psychological confrontation in which the very essence of his authority, cunning, and empire was on trial. It was a stage where the law, the media, and public opinion converged to challenge the invincibility of a man who had once seemed untouchable. From the outset, the trial was a spectacle. Newspapers plastered the city with headlines, sensationalizing every accusation, every whisper of corruption, and every claim of violence. The public, fascinated by the glamour, brutality, and audacity of organized crime, followed each development with avid interest. For Luciano, this attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it magnified the stakes, increasing the pressure and raising the potential for severe punishment. On the other, it offered an opportunity to manipulate perception, projecting an image of composure, intelligence, and inevitability. Every move in the courtroom was calculated, every appearance meticulously managed, as he sought to maintain psychological leverage over both jurors and observers. The charges against Luciano were formidable: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and in some cases involvement in violent acts designed to consolidate power. Prosecutors painted a picture of a calculating mastermind orchestrating crime on an industrial scale, controlling networks of violence, vice, and corruption. Witnesses, including former associates and coerced informants, provided testimony designed to erode the perception of loyalty and omerta that had protected his empire. Each revelation threatened to unravel years of careful planning, exposing the fragile underpinnings of alliances and operations. Luciano, ever the strategist, faced the challenge of countering this narrative while under intense scrutiny and without the ability to fully control the courtroom environment. Defense strategy became a psychological chess match. Luciano's legal team sought to humanize him, emphasizing his intelligence, pragmatism, and the supposed separation between his personal actions and the broader operations of his network. They highlighted ambiguities, challenged the credibility of witnesses, and attempted to introduce doubt regarding the evidence collected by law enforcement. For Luciano, the trial was as much about perception as about law. He understood that victory did not always require complete exoneration. It often required creating enough uncertainty, managing narratives, and exploiting divisions in testimony to achieve a favorable outcome or mitigate punishment. This approach reflected the same strategic thinking that had allowed him to dominate the underworld for years: anticipate moves, exploit weaknesses, and maintain control over critical elements of the situation. Media coverage intensified the psychological pressure. The trial became a public drama, a moral spectacle in which the figure of Luciano was both demonized and mythologized. Journalists scrutinized his every word, body language, and interaction, framing him alternately as a ruthless criminal mastermind or a clever strategist outwitting both rivals and law enforcement. This duality amplified the stakes, shaping public perception even before a verdict could be delivered. For Luciano, this attention was another layer of the hidden war he had long waged: the manipulation of perception as a tool of power. He understood that public opinion could influence jurors, prosecutors, and political actors, and he navigated this landscape with the same calculated precision he applied to criminal enterprises. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Luciano's downfall was not solely a result of legal strategy but also of the human element. Informants and former allies, either motivated by self-preservation or ambition, provided critical testimony. The very network he had built to survive betrayal and enforce omerta showed signs of vulnerability, as loyalty proved conditional under the pressure of legal scrutiny. Each revelation, each detail of illicit operations exposed in court, chipped away at the carefully constructed facade of invincibility that had long protected him. It was a stark reminder that no empire, however sophisticated, is immune to the combined forces of law, human ambition, and strategic miscalculation. Yet even amid these pressures, Luciano demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience. He remained composed, analytical, and strategically aware, leveraging his courtroom behavior to maintain authority and respect, even as the legal environment became increasingly hostile. Small gestures, measured words, and controlled expressions reinforced the perception of intelligence and calm, projecting the image of a man who remained in command even when the world seemed to be closing in. This ability to manage perception under extreme pressure reflected the same traits that had allowed him to rise through the underworld: foresight, emotional control, and an acute understanding of human psychology. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a verdict that marked the formal beginning of Luciano's fall from public power. He was convicted, sentenced, and forced to confront the limits of influence when faced with an organized legal system. Yet even in defeat, elements of his strategy persisted. The empire he had built did not collapse entirely, his influence endured through allies, and his ability to manipulate perception allowed him to negotiate conditions and maintain a measure of authority, even under imprisonment. The trial, in this sense, was both an endpoint and a transition, a moment where Luciano's invulnerability was tested, but where his strategic genius and psychological insight continued to shape the consequences of his empire's actions. The courtroom drama also highlighted a broader theme in Luciano's story: the interplay between perception, power, and morality. He was simultaneously feared and respected, reviled and admired, a figure whose genius lay not only in his criminal operations but in his understanding of human nature. The trial exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in any concentrated system of power, demonstrating that even the most disciplined empires are subject to the forces of law, betrayal, and public scrutiny. For Luciano, this moment represented both a personal crisis and a pivotal turning point in the narrative of organized crime, revealing the limits of control and the inevitability of consequence. In retrospect, the trial was as much a story of human psychology and strategy as it was of law and justice. Luciano faced the convergence of multiple pressures, legal, social, and organizational, and navigated them with a combination of intellect, composure, and foresight. While the sentence marked a clear setback, it also demonstrated his enduring skill in managing complex systems of loyalty, perception, and influence. The courtroom became a stage on which Luciano's genius, resilience, and vulnerabilities were simultaneously revealed, providing a window into the intricate interplay of power, risk, and human behavior that defined both his rise and the beginning of his fall. Luciano's incarceration did not mark the end of his influence. Rather, it transformed the nature of his power. From behind bars, he continued to wield authority over his empire, demonstrating that true leadership in the criminal world transcends physical presence. Prison, rather than being a limitation, became a new arena in which Luciano applied the same strategic genius that had propelled him to dominance on the streets of New York. He adapted to this environment with remarkable skill, understanding that influence is as much about perception, psychology, and loyalty as it is about proximity or visibility. From the outset, Luciano recognized that his absence from the streets could be compensated for through carefully maintained communication channels and loyal intermediaries. Letters, visitors, and coded messages became instruments of governance, allowing him to continue coordinating operations, resolving disputes, and maintaining order within his network. He ensured that key lieutenants remained loyal by reinforcing the principles of omerta, rewarding obedience, and selectively demonstrating the consequences of betrayal. Even confined within a cell, Luciano's reputation and strategic oversight created a perception of omnipresence, ensuring that his directives were followed with precision. The psychological dimension of controlling an empire from prison cannot be understated. Luciano understood that fear and respect were powerful tools, and he leveraged both to maintain discipline. Stories of his influence, cunning, and ruthlessness circulated even within the walls of the penitentiary, ensuring that both allies and potential challengers viewed him as a figure whose authority could not be easily challenged. By cultivating an aura of omnipotence, he minimized direct confrontation and created a system in which loyalty was incentivized and disloyalty deterred. This manipulation of perception was consistent with the strategies he had used throughout his career. Influence as much through belief as through action. Luciano also demonstrated adaptability in responding to the challenges of imprisonment. While his freedom was restricted, he was not powerless. He cultivated relationships with prison officials, negotiated privileges, and even found opportunities to further his influence outside the walls. These interactions were not casual, they were strategic, aimed at creating advantages for himself and his organization. By understanding the motivations of those around him, both inside and outside the prison, Luciano extended his operational reach and ensured that the empire he had built continued to function effectively despite his physical confinement. Control from prison required a combination of patience and calculated intervention. Luciano was acutely aware that the underworld could be volatile and that unauthorized ambition could destabilize the organization. He carefully monitored developments, ensuring that no single lieutenant accumulated enough power to challenge his authority. At the same time, he identified emerging threats and opportunities, using his network to neutralize rivals, secure alliances, and maintain profitability across operations. The ability to manage complex, multi-tiered systems from a distance reflected not only his organizational skills but also his profound understanding of human behavior and motivation. Luciano's ability to maintain power behind bars also underscores the central role of trust and fear in his empire. Loyal associates became extensions of his will, carrying out orders and enforcing discipline in ways that preserved the overall structure. At the same time, the implicit threat of consequences, reinforced through strategic demonstrations of power, ensured compliance. This balance between empowerment and intimidation allowed him to retain central authority without direct oversight, illustrating a sophisticated approach to leadership that combined delegation, surveillance, and psychological control. Perhaps most remarkably, Luciano's control during incarceration reflected his broader vision for the Mafia as a disciplined, organized, and strategic enterprise. He treated operations like a networked organization with defined roles, chains of command, and systems for monitoring performance. Even in confinement, he could orchestrate financial transactions, labor rackets, and illicit markets with precision. By embedding resilience into the structure of his organization, he ensured that temporary setbacks, such as imprisonment, would not collapse the empire he had painstakingly constructed. In effect, Luciano transformed his network into a self-sustaining machine capable of functioning under pressure, guided by principles he had instilled long before his arrest. The experience also shaped his personal evolution. Confronted with isolation, scrutiny, and the inevitability of consequences, Luciano was forced to reflect on the limits of power, the dynamics of loyalty, and the fragility of even the most sophisticated networks. This period reinforced the necessity of psychological mastery, strategic patience, and the careful calibration of relationships. In many ways, prison became an extension of the hidden wars he had navigated on the streets, a controlled environment in which observation, manipulation, and foresight determined survival and influence. Luciano's time behind bars also had broader implications for the Mafia. It demonstrated that leadership did not require constant physical presence. Influence could be maintained through psychological leverage, disciplined delegation, and strategic foresight. His continued control served as a model for successors, showing that an empire built on structure, loyalty, and fear could endure even under extraordinary circumstances. It highlighted the systemic resilience of organized crime when guided by a leader capable of anticipating risk, managing behavior, and coordinating operations with precision. Ultimately, Luciano's exercise of power from prison illustrates the enduring genius of his leadership. While others might have seen incarceration as a final defeat, he transformed it into a platform for control, demonstrating that authority is as much about perception, relationships, and strategy as it is about physical dominance. Through careful management, psychological insight, and strategic delegation, Luciano maintained the integrity of his empire, ensuring that the systems he had built continued to function and that his influence remained both feared and respected. In retrospect, this period highlights a critical lesson in the dynamics of power. True authority transcends circumstance, and the most enduring leaders are those who can maintain influence even when traditional levers of control are removed. Luciano's mastery of this principle allowed him not only to survive imprisonment but to continue shaping the criminal landscape, solidifying his reputation as one of the most intelligent, strategic, and psychologically adept figures in the history of organized crime. Prison, rather than ending his reign, became a testament to the sophistication and resilience of the empire he had built. Luciano's release from prison did not signal a return to normalcy. It marked the beginning of a new chapter defined by exile, constraint, and a profound re-evaluation of both power and identity. Deported to Italy in 1946, he was physically removed from the streets, alliances, and territories that had defined his empire for decades. For a man who had built influence through presence, negotiation, and intimidation, exile was a radical dislocation. Yet even in this forced isolation, Luciano's mind remained active, calculating, and strategic. The empire he had constructed could no longer be navigated in the familiar environments of New York's underworld, but the lessons of loyalty, psychology, and influence continued to guide him in unfamiliar territory. Italy, still reeling from the devastation of World War II, presented both limitations and opportunities. Luciano found himself in a society struggling with reconstruction, political instability, and economic scarcity. The world he returned to was markedly different from the one he had left, yet the same principles of power and strategy applied. He began to assess the environment, identifying potential allies, evaluating the positions of remaining contacts in the United States, and exploring ways to exert influence indirectly. While exile removed him from direct operational control, it did not eliminate his capacity to shape outcomes, manipulate perception, or maintain relevance. One of the key strategies Luciano employed during exile was the maintenance of networks through intermediaries. Trusted associates, both old and newly cultivated, acted as extensions of his influence, ensuring that his voice continued to carry weight even in absentia. Correspondence, emissaries, and covert meetings became critical tools for maintaining authority, negotiating alliances, and resolving disputes. In this sense, exile was a test of the structural integrity of the empire he had built. Could it function, adapt, and endure without the constant physical presence of its architect? Luciano's ability to answer this question in the affirmative is a testament to the foresight, organization, and resilience that had defined his career. Exile also forced Luciano into reflection, both strategic and philosophical. Deprived of the immediacy of power, he had the space to consider the consequences of past actions, the dynamics of loyalty and betrayal, and the transient nature of influence. He witnessed the evolution of organized crime from afar, observing how his methods and innovations had been adopted, modified, and institutionalized by those who remained in the United States. This period of distance provided him with a rare vantage point, the ability to see the broader patterns of power, the enduring influence of his organizational structures, and the vulnerabilities that even a sophisticated empire could not entirely eliminate. Despite physical separation from his operations, Luciano remained a central figure in the underworld. His reputation, forged through decades of strategic brilliance and psychological mastery, continued to command respect, fear, and loyalty. For many within the network, he remained a symbol of authority, a benchmark for intelligence and audacity, and a reminder of the organizational principles that had ensured profitability and stability. In this way, exile did not diminish his relevance. It merely transformed the channels through which his influence was exerted. At the same time, exile was a period of personal limitation. Luciano could no longer directly intervene in disputes, enforce discipline, or oversee operations with the immediacy he once had. Decisions were mediated through others, and his authority depended increasingly on trust, credibility, and the continued adherence of allies to the systems he had instilled. This required a delicate balance. Too much distance could erode control, while overly prescriptive directives risked undermining the autonomy of those executing his will. The exile tested not only the structural resilience of his empire but also his ability to manage human behavior from afar, applying the same principles of loyalty, fear, and influence in a context where direct oversight was impossible. Exile also accelerated a transformation in Luciano's personal philosophy. Removed from the immediate temptations and perils of the New York streets, he began to reflect on the larger meaning of power, legacy, and mortality. He considered the consequences of his choices, the fragility of empires, and the interplay of chance, strategy, and human nature. This introspection did not diminish his ambition or cunning. Rather, it added a layer of depth to his understanding of influence, revealing a man capable of analyzing not only the mechanics of crime but the psychology of those who wield it. Even in exile, Luciano remained engaged in global developments, particularly the intersections between organized crime, politics, and commerce. His experience with labor unions, bootlegging, and gambling provided insights into the broader mechanisms of power and corruption, and he maintained an active interest in monitoring the unfolding dynamics in the United States. By observing from a distance, he could assess the stability of the empire he had left behind, identify emerging threats, and advise trusted allies on strategic decisions. In this sense, exile was not a cessation of influence but a recalibration, shifting from direct intervention to strategic oversight. Ultimately, Luciano's exile and the endgame of his life illustrate the complex interplay between physical presence, perception, and enduring influence. Removed from the immediate levers of control, he relied on networks, psychological insight, and the structural integrity of his empire to maintain relevance. The period reflects both the limitations and the resilience of power. While exile constrained action, it could not entirely diminish the authority, respect, and strategic genius that Luciano had cultivated over decades. It was a phase in which intellect, foresight, and psychological mastery became the primary tools of survival and influence. In retrospect, the exile underscores a critical lesson about leadership and legacy. True influence is not confined to geography, visibility, or direct control. Luciano's ability to maintain relevance, shape outcomes, and oversee operations from a distance demonstrates that the architecture of power depends as much on structure, loyalty, and perception as it does on immediate action. His final years, defined by displacement, reflection, and strategic oversight, reveal a man who had transformed the nature of organized crime, leaving a lasting imprint on both the mechanics of the underworld and the psychology of leadership. Exile was not the end of Luciano's story, it was the concluding act in a life defined by vision, audacity, and the enduring mastery of power. Lucky Luciano's legacy is a story of strategy, organization, and enduring influence. He transformed chaotic street gangs into a disciplined criminal network, balancing loyalty, fear, and autonomy in a system that endured far beyond his presence. By professionalizing crime and creating structures like the Mafia Commission, he introduced order, stability, and efficiency, turning illicit operations into highly organized enterprises. His genius lay not only in operations but in understanding human behavior, managing allies, neutralizing rivals, and shaping perception to maintain authority. Culturally, he became a mythic figure, feared and respected, his life illustrating both audacity and the fragility of power. Luciano's influence persists through the systems, strategies, and psychological principles he pioneered. His life demonstrates that leadership and power are as much about foresight, organization, and human insight as they are about direct action, leaving an enduring mark on organized crime and offering timeless lessons on influence, control, and ambition. As the story of Lucky Luciano draws to a close, the full magnitude of his life, influence, and legacy becomes clear. From the chaotic streets of Lower Manhattan to the structured corridors of power he created within the Mafia, Luciano's journey is one of ambition, intellect, and relentless strategy. His life exemplifies the dualities that define the human pursuit of power: loyalty and betrayal, control and vulnerability, fear and respect. In examining his story, it is not simply the events themselves that resonate, but the patterns of thought, psychology, and decision-making that allowed a single man to reshape an entire underworld. Luciano's life was a study in contrasts. He emerged from poverty, navigating a harsh and unforgiving environment, yet rose to establish an empire characterized by meticulous organization and strategic foresight. Violence and ambition were his tools, but intelligence and psychological acuity were his weapons. While others relied solely on brute force, Luciano understood that perception, influence, and loyalty were equally critical to sustaining power. This balance between intellect and audacity allowed him to survive the hidden wars of the underworld, navigate betrayal, and consolidate authority over a network that spanned the city, the country, and eventually international operations. The arc of his life is equally instructive in understanding the fragility of power. Even a man as shrewd and strategic as Luciano could not remain untouchable indefinitely. Arrest, imprisonment, and exile underscore the limits of human control, revealing that the systems of loyalty, fear, and influence, while formidable, are never absolute. Yet Luciano's response to these challenges, the maintenance of authority from prison, the orchestration of networks from afar, and his adaptation to exile, demonstrates that true power lies not merely in physical presence but in strategy, perception, and psychological mastery. His ability to adapt to constraint without relinquishing influence is a defining element of his enduring significance. Luciano's story also invites reflection on the nature of morality and consequence. He operated within a world governed by its own rules, where betrayal could mean death, loyalty was transactional, and ambition demanded cunning. Yet, within this morally complex environment, he exemplified principles of order, discipline, and foresight that distinguished him from both rivals and contemporaries. His application of structure, negotiation, and strategy transformed disorganized criminal activity into a system that, while illicit, mirrored the efficiency and sophistication of legitimate enterprises. This duality, immense brilliance shadowed by violence and immorality, is central to understanding both the man and the myth of Lucky Luciano. Equally significant is the psychological dimension of his legacy. Luciano's genius lay in his understanding of human nature, the motivations that drive ambition, the fears that enforce loyalty, and the weaknesses that create opportunity. He manipulated these forces with subtlety and precision, orchestrating outcomes not solely through coercion, but through the careful calibration of trust, perception, and consequence. From his early days on the streets to the apex of his empire, he demonstrated a mastery of strategy that required both observation and instinct. This psychological sophistication ensured that his influence endured even in exile and that the systems he built continued to function in his absence. Ultimately, Luciano's story is about more than crime. It is about the architecture of power. He transformed chaos into order, fleeting opportunity into systemic influence, and individual ambition into a collective enterprise capable of endurance. His life illustrates that leadership is not merely the exercise of force but the ability to structure, manage, and anticipate. In doing so, he left a blueprint for modern organized crime, providing enduring lessons for historians, criminologists, and students of strategy alike. As the narrative concludes, the contrast between myth and reality becomes evident. Luciano's persona, feared, respected, and mythologized, cannot be disentangled from the structures he built, the strategic brilliance he demonstrated, and the consequences he endured. He was, in equal measure, a product of circumstance and a shaper of destiny, a man whose intellect and audacity left an indelible mark on the criminal world. His life reminds us that power is complex, fragile, and multifaceted, defined not only by actions but by perception, psychology, and the ability to navigate both loyalty and betrayal. In the final analysis, Lucky Luciano's story endures because it embodies the interplay of intellect, ambition, and human complexity. He was a man of extremes, capable of profound strategic insight and ruthless decision-making, yet also constrained by the very systems he helped create. His empire rose from chaos, thrived in an environment of constant danger, and endured even through incarceration and exile. His legacy is a testament to the power of foresight, the necessity of adaptability, and the enduring influence of a mind capable of mastering the intricate dance of loyalty, fear, and ambition. By the end, Luciano emerges not just as a historical figure, but as a symbol of the timeless dynamics of power. His life story serves as both inspiration and caution, a chronicle of brilliance tempered by risk, a lesson in leadership shaped by moral ambiguity, and a reflection on the intricate, often fragile, architecture of human influence. In remembering Lucky Luciano, we remember the intersection of intellect and audacity, the enduring lessons of strategy, and the profound impact one individual can have on the course of history, even from the shadows of the underworld.